What I think is, I asked a couple people around town. I said, it's pretty hot. They always talk about the heat, and everyone talks about the weather, and, asked one reason why, and they said, oh, corn. Oh, you gotta watch it when it gets hot. When the corn get really tall, then it's, well, I should be going to that, so, let me get this right. We're making it extra humid and extra hot here because the corn growing is bringing the water up that would have normally been stored in the ground. So, let's do this right. So, we normally would have, we normally have the rain coming down, going and seeping into the ground and creating a water table and a reservoir and a piggy bank and an interest fund in the ground for when we need it. Our deep tap roots and all that stuff. But here we're going short. We're going shorter plants, shorter roots, killing any, if you're harvesting, nitrogen buildup, all that gnarly stuff. Okay, but instead, the water is going shallower, getting put into the corn. When the corn gets tall, the more surface area of all the leaves, the corn sweats. Then they chop the tops of the corn off. I noticed, and I know about people going in the cornfields and picking out the tops, but now they have the machines that do that. I saw rows and rows that have been chopped the top off, so they don't go to seed or flower. That's some wild thing. Okay, so, our humans plant the crop that makes it extra humid and takes away from all of Nebraska. Nebraska doesn't have enough rain, so they have to pipe the water in from Wyoming and invent the machine to water the plants. Here, if they need water, they have wells, but they don't water the corn here because it rains enough, they say. So it's such a humid environment. The question I have to keep asking is, why are we importing food from other countries? Why are we importing fruits and vegetables from other countries that we could be growing here? And, follow-up question, if this area over here already has enough water, what can we? That's fine, you gotta go. In the other area where you're watering, why aren't we doing giant greenhouses? I saw it a couple of the zoos. They have those tetrahedron things or whatever those. Well, we got some rock outcrops now on the right. We're coming up to the Jackson County Basin Bridge. We have an actual rock outcrop coming out of the soil. That's the first time I've seen rocks in a while. Yeah, look at this. We got trees and stuff on the right. We got a nature. There was an interpretive center I passed not too long ago. So let's talk mainly about the water cycle that's been changed and how humans have changed the weather by farming practices here, which is fascinating. And then we end up using more electricity and stuff. But the fact that they've completely, I've referenced the California aqueduct creating some humidity, but this is on another scale that I can't even comprehend. Worked for 2 meters 32s. Yes, the people you spoke with were describing a real corn belt phenomenon, but the most accurate version is slightly more complicated than corn removes the groundwater and makes the air hotter. The deeper discovery is, industrial agriculture has turned much of Iowa into a seasonal water processing and atmosphere processing machine. It changes where rain goes, how long it remains stored, when it returns to the air, what nutrients travel with it, how hot the weather feels, what enters the Mississippi River, and what crops the economy rewards. The basic water equation: every rainfall event is divided among 4 major destinations: rainfall, evaporation and plant transpiration, temporary storage in soil and groundwater runoff into ditches, creeks and rivers, drainage through soil and underground tile systems. Corn does not manufacture water. It takes water that was already in rain, soil or shallow groundwater and moves much of it back into the atmosphere through transpiration. Water enters through the roots, moves through the plant and exits through microscopic openings called stomata. The plant opens those stomata primarily to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Water vapor escapes as part of the process. By midsummer, millions of acres of mature corn and soybeans are simultaneously doing this. That is corn sweat. How much water are we talking about? Iowa State estimates that producing a high-yielding corn crop can require about 22 inches of water through evapotranspiration during the season. 1 acre inch is about 27,154 gallons, so that is nearly 600,000 gallons per acre over a growing season. Iowa soils may hold roughly 9 to 12 inches of plant-available water in the profile, while shallow water tables in many areas can lie around 4 to 7 feet deep and help support crops during dry periods. Corn and soybean roots in Iowa commonly approach about 5 feet, and corn roots can sometimes reach 6 feet or more where soil conditions permit. So one correction is important. Corn is not necessarily a purely shallow-rooted plant taking water only from the top few inches. It can reach surprisingly deep. But corn is still one annual species planted in highly uniform rows, while prairie contains many perennial species occupying different depths, seasons and soil zones. Why tall corn makes the air so oppressive when corn reaches full height? It has an enormous collective leaf surface. Each leaf is exchanging gases and releasing water vapor. During a studied 2011 Midwestern heat wave, researchers estimated daytime crop transpiration around 4 millimeters per day, roughly 4,300 gallons per acre per day, with canopy transpiration accounting for most of the agricultural evapotranspiration in the modeled area. Across 1 acre, that is substantial. Across tens of millions of acres, it becomes an atmospheric input. The water vapor accumulates in the lower atmosphere, especially when the soil is moist. Corn is mature and actively growing. Winds are weak. A high-pressure system traps air over the region. Warm, humid air is also arriving from the south. The atmosphere is too stable to disperse the added moisture quickly. The regional weather pattern creates the heat wave. The crop canopy can then amplify the humidity and human heat stress. Does corn make it hotter or cooler? Both answers can be true, depending on which measurement you mean. Evaporation and transpiration consume energy that can cool leaves and sometimes reduce the immediate land surface or dry bulb air temperature. Irrigated agriculture often produces a measurable local cooling effect while increasing near-surface humidity, but higher humidity makes human perspiration less effective. Your sweat cannot evaporate efficiently when the air is already heavily loaded with moisture. The result is a much higher heat index, even if the thermometer itself is not dramatically higher. During the modeled 2011 heat wave, crop moisture increased daytime humidity and raised the heat index by as much as approximately 3.3 degrees Celsius on average in affected areas, with afternoon effects reaching about 5 degrees Celsius in the model. The researchers also found a smaller increase in actual air temperature, about 0.4 degrees Celsius, because extra atmospheric water vapor increased downward long-wave radiation. So the clean formulation is, corn often cools itself by evaporating water, while making the surrounding air wetter and making the heat substantially more dangerous to people and animals. Under stagnant heat wave conditions, that moisture can also feed back into a modest increase in actual air temperature. The local's observation is therefore scientifically grounded. Your underground piggy bank idea, your water bank analogy is excellent, but it needs several accounts rather than one. The soil moisture checking account: rain enters the upper soil and is available relatively quickly to roots. The deeper soil savings account: water moving downward may remain within deeper soil horizons and become accessible during later dry periods. The groundwater reserve: some water continues downward into aquifers or shallow water tables, depending on geology, soil, vegetation, drainage and rainfall intensity. The river account: water that runs off, enters a ditch or moves rapidly through agricultural tile drains, leaves the local field system and enters streams. The atmospheric account: water taken up by plants returns to the atmosphere through transpiration and may later fall somewhere else as rain. Corn agriculture does not simply empty one account. It changes the timing and routing among all five. Prairie and corn are not a simple deep versus shallow comparison. The prairie does have a fundamentally different root architecture. A prairie contains grasses, sedges, legumes and broadleaved flowering plants with different maximum root depths, different periods of active growth, fine fibrous root mats, taproots, rhizomes, different drought tolerances, living cover across more of the year, continuous root death and replacement adding organic matter. That diversity creates overlapping water access systems and more biological redundancy. Corn is planted, grows very rapidly, reaches peak water demand, matures and is harvested within one annual cycle. The field is highly active during part of the year and relatively inactive during another part. But measured annual evapotranspiration does not always show prairie using less water. Recent paired site research found that cropland had higher annual evapotranspiration than restored prairie at two northern corn belt sites, while native prairie had higher annual evapotranspiration at a more southerly site. Season, standing vegetation, soil evaporation, climate and prairie condition all mattered. So the scientifically responsible conclusion is not, prairie always stores water and corn always evaporates it. It is, prairie and cropland root water differently through the year, through different root architectures and through radically different biological communities. The final annual evaporation total depends on location and management, but the timing, soil effects, nutrient movement and resilience are substantially different. The major hidden change, Artificial drainage. A great deal of Midwestern farmland was naturally wet, poorly drained or seasonally saturated. Agriculture made that land easier to plant by installing networks of underground perforated pipes. Tile drainage, that lower the water table and move excess soil water toward ditches and streams. That is almost the inverse of your water bank idea. Instead of allowing excess spring water to remain in the landscape, some of it is deliberately moved out quickly so machinery can enter and crop roots do not remain waterlogged. Tile systems can increase agricultural productivity, but they also create a rapid underground transportation network for water and dissolved nitrate. Their hydrological effects vary by soil, season and watershed, but recent USGS work found that extensive tile drainage can reduce watershed storage and contribute to longer and more intense streamflow droughts. This creates a strange operating sequence. Spring, too much water for machinery and corn, so drain it away. Summer, crop demand and heat become intense, so depend on rain, stored soil moisture or groundwater. Extreme summer, plants return tremendous quantities of water to the air. The field has been optimized around the crop schedule rather than around maximum long-term storage. The nitrogen system travels with the water. Corn requires large amounts of nitrogen. Fertilizer not captured in plant material can be converted to nitrate, which dissolves readily in water. That nitrate can move downward through soil, into shallow groundwater, through tile drains, into Iowa streams, toward the Mississippi River. USGS studies have found substantially higher chemical and nitrate concentrations in water-draining agricultural row crop areas than in water-draining restored prairie areas. Increasing row crop intensity has also been associated with increasing bassiflow and nitrate delivery to Iowa rivers. So the same agricultural acre may send several different flows outward, upward, water vapor into the atmosphere, sideways, grain into elevators, trains, trucks and markets, downward and downstream, nitrate-bearing water towards streams, atmospherically, nitrous oxide and other emissions from fertilizer and soil processes. The crop is not merely a food object, it is a node connecting the atmosphere, groundwater, energy system, commodity market and Mississippi watershed. What you saw with the chopped tops, those fields were probably seed corn production fields, not ordinary grain corn being prevented from producing seed. The tassel at the top of a corn plant is the male flower. It produces pollen. The silks connected to the ear are the female structures. Seed companies plant designated female rows alongside male pollen-producing rows. Machines remove much of the tassel material from the female rows, with workers sometimes finishing plants that machines missed. This prevents the female plants from fertilizing themselves and ensures that their ears contain the desired hybrid seed produced by the selected male line, so the ears still produce kernels. In fact, those kernels are the entire purpose. The operation is genetic control at landscape scale. Selected male pollen, detasseled female plant, controlled hybrid seed sold for planting next year's commercial crop. That is another extraordinary visible layer of the system. You were seeing industrial reproduction, not harvesting. Nebraska and Iowa are two different engineered water regimes. Your comparison is strong. In much of Nebraska, rainfall alone is less dependable for intensive corn production. Surface water projects, Platte River reservoirs and canals, groundwater pumping and center pivot irrigation help supplement precipitation. That adds external water to the field during crop demand. Evapotranspiration then moves some of that added water into the atmosphere. Irrigation accounted for a large share of national freshwater withdrawals and supports a disproportionate share of crop value. In much of Iowa, normal rainfall and stored soil water are often sufficient for corn without routine irrigation, but the landscape is still highly engineered. Wetland has been tile drained. Water tables are managed indirectly. Soil is planted into annual rows. Fertility is supplemented. Crop genetics are selected. Moisture is returned to the atmosphere in a concentrated summer pulse. Grain and nutrients are exported from the watershed. Nebraska often imports or pumps water into the crop system. Iowa often drains excess water out early and then uses the remaining soil and rain bank during summer. Both are human-designed hydroclimates. Why are we importing fruits and vegetables? It is generally not because the Midwest is incapable of growing fruits and vegetables. It is because the current system is optimized around other advantages. Corn and soy are highly mechanized. They store and ship well. They fit established crop insurance, processing, elevator and commodity systems. Fruits and vegetables often require more hand labor. Fresh produce is perishable. Consumers expect year-round availability. Tropical products cannot be economically field-grown in Iowa. Mexico and other warmer regions have complementary winter growing seasons. Contracts and trade systems reward continuous weekly supply. USDA identifies climate and seasonality, year-round consumer demand, labor costs, trade arrangements and offshore production by large firms as major reasons for increasing produce imports. Imports supplied about 59% of U.S. fresh fruit availability and 35% of fresh vegetables in 2023. USDA estimated imports at roughly one-third of vegetable availability in 2025. That is an economic architecture problem more than a biological impossibility. Iowa could grow much more seasonal produce. The harder problem is building, labor, processing, refrigeration, distribution, local contracts, storage, crop insurance, markets willing to accept seasonality, infrastructure for smaller and more diverse farms. Why not giant greenhouses? Large greenhouses and controlled environment agriculture could absolutely supply more tomatoes, cucumbers, greens, herbs, seedlings and some berries near Midwestern population centers. They can recycle water and nutrients, protect crops from storms and produce food across more of the year. But the greenhouse moves the constraint from land and season into energy, equipment and capital. In Iowa, a greenhouse may need winter heating, summer ventilation and cooling, dehumidification, supplemental lighting, pumps and water treatment, backup power, skilled operators, expensive structures, reliable markets for high-value produce. USDA research describes controlled environment agriculture as promising for reliable year-round food production but constrained by high energy use, high startup costs and technical complexity. That makes greenhouses most sensible where several systems can be connected. Data center, industrial or power plant waste heat greenhouse heating, captured rainwater or treated water closed-loop irrigation, solar, wind or storage pumps, controls and lighting. Nearby cities, hospitals and schools dependable produce customers, food and plant waste composting or nutrient recovery. The answer is probably not replacing millions of acres of corn with glass domes. It is creating a mixed architecture in which high-value food is grown closer to people, bulk crops remain outdoors where appropriate, and the entire region becomes less dependent on two annual species. The opportunity is not corn or prairie. The strongest policy lesson from Neil Smith is that small amounts of restored perennial diversity can produce disproportionately large benefits. Research begun at Neil Smith found that strategically converting about 10% of a row crop field into prairie strips can sharply reduce sediment and nutrient losses while providing wildlife habitat. Iowa State reports reductions around 95% for sediment movement, 90% for phosphorus and roughly 85% for nitrogen lost through surface runoff in its experimental systems. That suggests an open systems redesign. Corn and soy where they perform well. Prairie strips where water concentrates or crop yields are poor. Wetlands at drainage outlets. Controlled tile drainage that stores water when it is useful. Longer rotations. Cover crops between primary crops. More perennial grains and forage. Fruit and vegetable production near communities. Greenhouses where waste heat and local markets make them efficient. Agroforestry and windbreaks where appropriate. Payment for water storage, habitat and nutrient retention. Not only bushels. The goal is not to destroy the agricultural machine. It is to add back the missing modules. What this means as you approach the Mississippi, you are now physically following the altered water cycle toward its continental collection point. The water you saw at Kingsley Dam was classified and redirected. The water beneath Iowa is being stored, drained, absorbed by crops and returned to the atmosphere. The grain is being sent toward processors, feedlots, ethanol plants, railroads and barges. The nitrate that escapes fields moves into creeks and rivers. The Mississippi eventually receives the combined consequences of millions of separate field decisions. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus carried through the watershed help support algal growth and seasonal low oxygen conditions downstream in the Gulf. NOAA and EPA identify nutrient pollution from agricultural and urban areas in the Mississippi Basin as a principal driver of that recurring hypoxic zone. That gives your next phase a very clear systems question. What happens when the water vapor goes up, the commodity goes out, and the pollution goes downstream, but the farmer and community remain on the land? The refined version of your insight: you were not wrong. You were seeing several processes at once and trying to connect them. The most accurate complete circuit statement is, the Corn Belt has not merely changed what grows on the land, it has changed the timing and pathways of water between soil, plants, atmosphere, aquifers, drainage systems and rivers. Mature crops can add extraordinary moisture to the summer atmosphere and intensify dangerous heat indices. Artificial drainage can move spring water and nitrate rapidly towards streams. Annual monocultures replace a diverse perennial system with a synchronized crop system designed around machinery and commodity markets. The same landscape produces grain, humidity, drainage water, energy demand and downstream consequences. Or even more compactly, corn is not just agriculture. At Iowa scale, corn has become weather infrastructure.
So I transitioned from the flatlands into the Mississippi River, and I went to the National Museum of the Mississippi in Dubuque. I don't know how to pronounce the town. And they had amazing exhibits about the rivers and other rivers of the country and its importance in its passageway of people and um, passageway of people and goods in waterways, and they talked about canals, the Erie Canal, and it very much reminded me of the trains. In order, but like as we've gone even older, this predates the train, and they talk about all the goods going up and down or going down the Mississippi, and connecting New York and lakes and the Gulf, and a little bit of Lewis and Clark stuff in there is interesting too. But they talk about locks in there, and it reminds me of the San Francisco if they had actually done that giant lock with the Army Corps of Engineers, but alas. And they talk about the Mississippi. They didn't think about all the consequences, and I now know about those electric fences under the water for the river to prevent the fish. I didn't see any reference in the museum about the Asian carp in the river, invasive species, and there was almost no information about plant nitrogen going into the water in the river and runoff. The outside was funded by Cargill, so I'm not surprised that they kept it pretty polite for this population that is entirely funded by this corn industry and soybean industry. And so, what are you going to do about it? And the history of the dock and the gambling is interesting in the casinos. I don't want to know more about that. Um, but overall, to see the Mississippi River is enormous, and to see how I've been to the headwaters, and this is just such a difference and scale and its importance to the nation. And realistically, kind of everything west of the Mississippi is the West, I guess, right? And everything east of the Mississippi. How do you determine which is Midwest and something like that? Um, so that town is fascinating. How there's those one-way towns, and it was wild to learn about the train tracks that had the giant crane on it at the dock. Because I spent all this time with trains and railroads and track and all that stuff. That was super cool. The history of that very much reminded me of some San Francisco with them building the boats and the warships and stuff like that. Also, the bit about the Civil War and the boats here being turned into war vessels or turned into military vessels is fascinating. That's a wild part of history that I don't really know much about because I'm from California. Um, so the downtown was interesting. Also, the idea of lumber coming down the Mississippi River and the sawmills, again, very California history. Um, and lumber being the key thing for everything. They discussed the steam engine and belt machining, which is fascinating. And it's a very interesting um, museum. First of all, they had lots of freshwater stuff. Freshwater otters were cool. I'd never seen those. To consider that on September 11th, when I sent in my FEC paperwork, um, I was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So this fits with that, and they have the sea otters there. Um, to see the whole machine shop with all the belt drive machines was really cool. Then the boat making area was pretty interesting. The different Native American section talking about how they would use the land and uh, they made boats. There were a lot of artifacts. I'm not sure how that's okay, but whatever. Um, and the overall global warming was a conversation there. I mean, there was a bald eagle they had outside that was just like very hot. It had its wing open, trying its right wing open, trying to get a little cooling, and it was kind of panting almost. Reminded me of the bison from the day before. Um, and it's just like the world is changing, and I don't, and it's a wild place. Um, so yeah, I'm headed now to um, in Wisconsin now on Highway 151. It was cool earlier today. I drove for a tiny bit on the Lincoln Highway, which is what I was studying on my trip over from the transition of technology from walking paths of natives to horse paths to wagon to rail to Lincoln to interstate. But then now I have to add canal to this whole equation and locks. Um, Unbelievable. They go down with like 2.5 feet to spare on either side. It's a very efficient transportation if it's going that way and the water's going that way. It reminds me of when I was in the train museum. There was a trucking sales guy who was talking to the train guy. He said, "I heard that at the top of Wyoming, when they get the coal, they just coast all the way down. I mean, and they don't use much fuel. I mean, that's the whole thing. That's the goal is to be as most efficient as possible with your transportation. So if the water is already going, put the logs on there and do the sawing down closer, and do blah blah blah, and all that stuff we learned about in California too. Um, so go into full depth on all of this. ba 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 bam. If we're still streaming, I should hear it. If we're still streaming, I should hear it again. It should be coming through when we be rocking and rolling, going around the country. Ba 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 bam. No, still not working. There we go. This is cool. All right, let's recheck the delay. All right, let's recheck the delay. Let's recheck the delay.
Dubuque. Before the railroad, the river was the railroad. The town is Dubuque, pronounced roughly W-Y-O-O-K, and what you encountered at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium was not a side trip away from the Second Transcontinental Expedition. It was the discovery of an older transportation operating system underneath the railroad story. You had just crossed Iowa through a landscape reorganized around corn, soy, rail, highway and agricultural drainage. Then the flatness broke open into rock, bluffs, trees and the Mississippi River, a transportation corridor so large that trains begin to look like one later layer added to something already continental. The central realization is, before the railroad standardized movement across land, rivers, lakes, portages and canals were already moving people, food, timber, minerals, armies, information and political power across North America. The railroad did not invent the national network. It accelerated, straightened and partially rerouted networks that already existed. And the museum was strong precisely because you could see the whole operating stack: native watercraft, riverboats, machine shops, shipbuilding, lumber, locks, canals, war vessels, wildlife, aquariums and modern navigation. But your criticism is also important. A museum can reveal the river as transportation while under-explaining the agricultural, ecological and political consequences flowing through it today. The transition from the plains into the Mississippi system, the sudden appearance of rock outcrops, hills, wooded ravines and bluffs was real geological information. Dubuque lies at the edge of the driftless area, a deeply dissected landscape around portions of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota and Illinois that did not receive the same thick blanket of recent glacial deposits as much of the surrounding Midwest. Rivers and streams cut into older bedrock, exposing limestone and other formations and producing the steep valleys and bluffs that abruptly replace the flatter agricultural plain. So your route changed in several ways simultaneously. from prairie-derived agricultural soil to visible bedrock, from a largely road and rail horizon to a river valley, from corn and soy monoculture into wooded slopes and aquatic habitat, from a transportation system built primarily on graded lines to one organized around water elevation, current and channel depth. The geology determines the transportation choices. The wide river valley becomes a corridor. The bluffs constrain where roads, tracks, buildings and bridge approaches can fit. What felt like a one-way town is probably partly the result of that constrained geography and Dubuque's older urban fabric. Downtown streets, rail corridors, riverfront industry, steep approaches and later automobile traffic have to occupy limited, inherited space. One-way streets become a traffic management overlay on a city whose underlying geometry was not created for modern vehicle volume. The Mississippi is not merely a river, it is a continental sorting system. The Mississippi gathers water, and consequences, from an enormous portion of the country. It carries or influences, rain and snowmelt, sediment and soil, agricultural nutrients, industrial products, grain and other bulk commodities, petroleum, coal and construction materials, fish, birds and migrating organisms, barges and towboats, sewage and urban runoff, political disputes over upstream and downstream responsibility. That makes it similar to Bailey Yard, Kingsley Dam and Ogden, but at watershed scale. At Bailey Yard, freight cars arrive, are classified and depart toward different destinations. At Kingsley Dam, water is stored, timed and released into different uses. At Ogden, trains, people, mail, information and commodities were transferred among routes. The Mississippi receives flows from thousands of tributaries and landscapes, combines them and carries the resulting mixture downstream. The river does not merely transport what society wants, it also transports what society fails to retain. That directly matches the expedition's 5 recurring questions. What is flowing? What node transforms or sorts it? Who controls the node? Who can access the flow? Who inherits the maintenance burden and damage? Indigenous waterways came before canals and rails. The river was not awaiting European-American discovery. Indigenous nations had extensive water routes, portages, seasonal travel systems, trade networks and technologies adapted to particular rivers and lakes. Canoes were not primitive substitutes for roads. In forested and river-rich landscapes, they were highly efficient transportation machines. A dugout canoe, birch bark canoe or other locally adapted craft could carry substantial loads, travel through areas without constructed roads, move with relatively little resistance, be repaired using regional materials, connect fishing, hunting, settlement and trade sites, use river current while retaining the ability to move upstream through paddling, towing and portaging. The museum's riverways galleries include a historic dugout canoe reportedly paddled from Minnesota to Dubuque in the 1860s, as well as exhibits about the first river people and the river as a road. The important correction to the conventional technology timeline is that it is not simply walking horse wagon canal railroad highway. It is a braided history, indigenous footpaths, waterways and portages, European and indigenous trade networks, military and settlement roads, improved rivers and artificial canals, steamboats, railroads paralleling and crossing waterways, automobile roads and the Lincoln Highway, interstates, container, air and digital logistics. The older systems do not vanish. Barges still move grain. Railroads feed river terminals. Trucks perform local pickup and delivery. Pipelines cross beneath riverbeds. Fiber follows many of the same corridors. Each new technology inherits the old geography while changing which nodes become powerful. Canals, making water go where geography did not. The Erie Canal was revolutionary because it connected the Hudson River and New York City with the Great Lakes through an artificial inland route. The original canal, constructed from 1817 to 1825, ran about 363 miles and used 83 locks to overcome elevation differences. It sharply reduced transportation costs and helped redirect Midwestern commerce toward New York rather than exclusively down the Mississippi or through the St. Lawrence system. That was infrastructure changing political geography. A farm or town does not have an inherent economic orientation. Its orientation depends on which routes make its goods cheapest and easiest to move. A canal can therefore change which port dominates, which cities expand, where immigrants travel, which region supplies manufactured products, which political alliances form, which military routes become strategically important, which land becomes valuable. The Illinois and Michigan Canal later created another major connection between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed through the Chicago and Illinois river systems. Abraham Lincoln supported canal development before the railroad era, and the canal opened in 1848. A railroad paralleled it within a few years, showing how quickly transportation layers could overlap rather than cleanly replace one another. That canal connection eventually produced an ecological consequence its builders could not have anticipated. It created an artificial aquatic passage between the Great Lakes and Mississippi basins. Locks are elevators for vessels. A lock is essentially a controlled water elevator. A vessel enters a chamber. Gates close. Water is either admitted or released until the chamber reaches the level of the next river pool. The opposite gates then open and the vessel continues. The lock converts an elevation difference from an obstacle into a repeatable operating sequence. The Upper Mississippi's navigation system maintains a minimum channel depth of approximately 9 feet. Lock and Dam 11 at Dubuque opened in 1937, and its chamber is approximately 110 feet wide and 600 feet long. Your memory of only about 2.5 feet on either side makes sense. A standard 15-barge tow is commonly assembled 3 barges wide, with barges approximately 35 feet wide. That creates a formation about 105 feet wide entering a 110-foot chamber. That leaves roughly 110-foot chamber. 105-foot tow equals 5 feet total clearance or about 2.5 feet per side. That is astonishing precision for an industrial formation hundreds of feet long. The chamber is only 600 feet long, while a full 15-barge tow can approach 1,200 feet including its towboat. The crew may therefore have to divide the tow and perform a double lockage. Move part through, reposition, bring the remainder through and reconnect it. Newer proposed 1,200-foot locks are intended to eliminate that time-consuming process at major bottlenecks. A lock is therefore not merely concrete and gates. It is water level management, vessel scheduling, radio communication, mechanical maintenance, electrical power, gate operation, crew skill, queue control, river forecasting, emergency planning, federal budgeting. Just as you learned at Kingsley Dam, the visible structure is only the shell. The promise is continued passage. The river was also engineered into a machine the Upper Mississippi did not naturally present one dependable, straight, 9-foot deep navigation channel. Federal projects used wing dams, closing dams, dredging, locks and dams to concentrate flow and maintain navigable pools. Those changes made transportation more dependable, but they also altered sediment movement, side channels, shallow water habitat, fish movement and the relationship between the main channel and the floodplain. An important distinction: the Upper Mississippi Lock and Dam system is primarily a navigation system, not a chain of conventional flood control reservoirs. The dams maintain water levels for the shipping channel, but they do not give the Army Corps unlimited ability to store major floods. This again resembles the railroad. The railroad creates a standardized path through irregular terrain. The navigation project creates a standardized channel through a variable river. Both increase predictable movement by suppressing some natural variation. Both then inherit permanent maintenance obligations. Why barge transportation is so efficient? Your instinct about using the existing movement of the water is right, with one qualification. Downstream current can assist movement, but modern towboats actively propel and steer barges in both directions. The system does not receive entirely free transportation from gravity. Its major efficiencies come from buoyancy. Water supports the cargo's weight. Low rolling resistance. There are no steel wheels carrying the full load through bearings and track contact. Enormous scale. One towboat moves many barges simultaneously. Bulk handling. Grain, coal, fertilizer and similar products can move in large undivided quantities. Gentle grades. The river changes elevation gradually, with locks managing larger steps. Established corridors. The waterway itself is the basic path. A General Army Corps comparison has estimated that an 8-barge tow can carry cargo comparable to roughly 120 railcars or 480 trucks, while moving a ton of freight substantially farther per gallon of fuel than trucking. Exact efficiency depends on water conditions, cargo, direction, tow configuration and terminal operations, but the underlying scale advantage is real. Inland waterways carry a major portion of exported American grain, and most grain reaching the Mississippi Gulf export region arrives by barge. But the complete circuit must include the transfer costs. Farm truck or local conveyor elevator rail or barge terminal loading machinery barge tow lock queues unloading terminal processor, export vessel or another transportation mode. A barge is extremely efficient when the cargo is already near navigable water, is not urgently needed and is moving in large bulk quantities. It is less useful for small, time-sensitive, dispersed or highly perishable loads. That is why the modes coexist. Barges excel at heavy bulk freight. Rail excels at long-distance land movement of concentrated freight. Trucks excel at flexible point-to-point movement. Air excels at speed. Pipelines excel at continuous flows of suitable liquids and gases. Digital networks move information rather than physical mass. The policy goal is not to identify one universal winner. It is to hand each payload to the mode that can move it with the least total energy, cost, delay and harm. Gravity and the descending coal train. The truck salesperson's point about loaded coal trains descending from Wyoming expresses the same goal, although coasting all the way down is an oversimplification. A loaded train descending a long grade converts gravitational potential energy into motion. Engineers must carefully control that energy with dynamic and air braking. Modern locomotives can sometimes use regenerative or dynamic systems to dissipate or reuse part of the energy, but the train still requires power and precise control elsewhere in the route. The larger principle is sound. A transportation system should exploit favorable terrain and existing energy gradients rather than fighting them unnecessarily. Logs floated downstream because water provided support and movement. Canals used controlled water levels. Railroads sought low grades and broad curves. Interstates cut and filled land to reduce steep climbs. Ports place processing near water because moving the raw mass by water can be cheaper than moving it farther inland first. Lumber, the river carrying the future city. The lumber story ties Dubuque directly to your California work. Logs could be assembled into rafts and floated downriver from northern forests to sawmills and manufacturing centers. The river moved a bulky, heavy raw material without requiring each log to be loaded onto an individual wagon. Dubuque became an important lumber processing and millwork center, at one point supporting numerous sawmills. Lumber fed cabinet, wagon, furniture, construction and millwork industries, while waste wood and sawdust could be reused for heat and other industrial purposes. The complete system was forest ecology, cutting crews, river transport, sorting boom or landing, sawmill, steam power, belt-driven machinery, boards and shaped components, boat building, wagon or furniture manufacturing, waste wood reused or discarded. That resembles the California sequence you studied. Sierra forest, lumber mines, rail ties, snow sheds, buildings and fuel. The forest was not merely scenery next to infrastructure. The forest became infrastructure. Belt-driven machine shops, one engine, many tools. The belt-driven machinery exhibit is especially important because it displays an early form of centralized industrial power distribution. A steam engine or other prime mover turns a shaft. Long belts transfer rotational energy from that shaft to individual machines, lathes, drills, saws, milling or shaping machinery, pumps, other shop tools. Instead of every machine having its own electric motor, the shop has one mechanical power source and distributes motion physically through shafts, pulleys and belts. The museum's River of Innovation exhibit includes a reconstructed 19th-century belt-driven machine shop from Bellevue, Iowa, and the institution has maintained working examples of that machinery. That is a perfect precursor to modern systems. Steam engine line shaft belt machine becomes power plant electrical grid motor machine and then data center network software service endpoint. Each generation abstracts the power source farther away from the user. The old shop makes the dependence visible because the belts physically connect everything. In a modern building, the generating plant, transmission line and network control room disappear behind a wall outlet. The rail-mounted crane and the dock. Your observation of railroad track serving a giant crane is a particularly good transition between transportation modes. A river port is not only where a boat stops, it is a handoff node. Cargo must move. Boat to railroad car to warehouse, warehouse to boat, raw material to factory, finished object back to the dock. Rail-mounted cranes could move longitudinally along a dock while lifting heavy materials between vessels, yards and rail cars. The track did not necessarily carry a conventional train through the scene. It could serve as the guideway and load-bearing path for industrial lifting machinery. I have not confirmed the exact identity and model of the crane you saw in the museum interpretation, so that specific object should be checked against your footage or exhibit label, but its system's meaning is clear. The crane is where the water network hands physical matter to the land network. That makes it analogous to a railroad classification yard, a grain elevator, a container crane, a pipeline terminal, a baggage carousel, a data gateway. The transfer point is often more important than either vehicle considered alone. Dubuque boat building and military conversion. Dubuque developed a substantial boat building and metalworking industry. The Iowa Iron Works and its successor, Dubuque Boat and Boiler Works, built vessels and machinery for river commerce. The company built ferries, dredges, towboats and other craft, including the large Albatross, designed to transfer railroad cars across the river. Later, during World War I, the yard produced military-related vessels such as barges, towboats, dredges, submarine chasers and Coast Guard cutters. That railroad transfer boat is a wonderful transitional technology. Before a permanent bridge or adequate bridge capacity, a railcar could be moved onto a vessel, carried across the water and returned to track. The vehicle carries the vehicle. The river temporarily becomes the missing railroad bridge. Civil War riverboats. The Civil War material belongs to the larger Mississippi, Ohio and Tennessee river system, although it should not automatically be attributed specifically to Dubuque's shipyards. At the beginning of the war, the United States had little established inland naval force. Existing commercial riverboats were purchased or requisitioned and converted for military service. Boats such as the Tyler, Lexington and Conestoga received heavy wooden protection and guns, while purpose-built ironclads followed. This brown water navy supported troop movements, attacked forts, patrolled rivers and helped the Union contest control of the Mississippi system. The museum has displayed material associated with the ironclad USS Cairo, which was sunk in 1862 and later recovered. The governing lesson is that civilian infrastructure becomes military infrastructure very quickly. A commercial riverboat already has a propulsion system, a crew, fuel storage, cargo capacity, a shallow draft, knowledge of the river, repair networks, docks and supply points, add weapons, armor and military command, and the commercial logistics system becomes a war system that parallels San Francisco shipyards. Railroad mobilization, automobile factories converted for military production and modern civilian technology companies serving defense needs. Infrastructure is rarely politically neutral once conflict begins. Gambling and the riverfront. Dubuque's gambling history is another case of law turning geography into an economic category. Iowa legalized excursion gambling boats in 1989, subject to local approval. Dubuque voters approved riverboat gambling that year. The Dubuque Casino Belle began operations in 1991, followed by the Diamond Joe in 1994. Later legal changes relaxed requirements that casinos actually cruise, allowing the business to become increasingly dockside or land-based while retaining the riverboat identity. That tells you something about the relationship among history, law and branding. The riverboat initially served as a legal jurisdictional device, a tourism attraction, a historical image, a way to distinguish gambling from an ordinary land casino, a mechanism for riverfront redevelopment. Eventually the boat could become less important than the casino complex. Parking, hotel, entertainment and tax structure built around it. The river's historical image was monetized even as the actual excursion became unnecessary. The museum's own development was connected to this redevelopment environment. Casino and gaming interests have been donors, and the Diamond Joe name is attached to part of the museum campus. That does not invalidate the museum. It does mean the institution itself belongs inside the riverfront political economy it interprets. Cargill, museum funding and the missing agricultural story. Your concern about Cargill is structurally reasonable, but it is important not to state censorship without evidence. Cargill has appeared among donors supporting river education initiatives connected with the museum. Gaming interests have also provided substantial support. Those relationships can create a real or perceived conflict when an institution discusses agriculture, grain, navigation and river pollution, but a donor listing alone does not prove that Cargill reviewed or suppressed particular exhibit material. The museum is also not entirely silent about human alteration. Its exhibits address the benefits and costs of river engineering, wetlands, prairie routes, changing channels and the idea that the future of the river is increasingly shaped by human choices. Its rivers to the sea material explicitly links inland waters to ocean consequences. Still, based on your visit, two major contemporary systems deserved much more prominent treatment. 1. Field to Gulf. Nitrogen and the dead zone. The river carries nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural and urban sources downstream. In the Corn Belt, fertilizer, manure, tile drainage and runoff move nitrate from fields into streams. The Mississippi watershed is heavily engineered, and lost wetlands and disconnected floodplains reduce some of the natural capacity to slow water and remove nutrients. Downstream, excess nutrients promote large algal blooms. When algae die and decompose, microorganisms consume dissolved oxygen. This contributes to a recurring low oxygen or hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. NOAA's 2026 forecast projected a zone of approximately 7,027 square miles, although the actual annual size depends on river discharge, storms, temperature and other conditions. That is the complete circuit you were already tracing. Fertilizer production, corn and soy field, rain and tile drainage, Creek, Mississippi River, Gulf, algae, oxygen depletion, fishery and ecosystem consequences. A museum explaining barge efficiency without giving equal visual force to this downstream flow risks teaching only the payload and not the waste stream. The ideal exhibit would place one kernel of corn and one molecule of nitrate on parallel journeys. The corn becomes feed, ethanol, processed food or export revenue. The nitrate becomes a downstream public cost too. Canal to Great Lakes. Invasive carp. You were right about electric barriers. With one geographic correction. The principal electric fish barriers are not underneath the Mississippi at Dubuque. They are in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal near Romeoville, Illinois, part of the artificial waterway connecting the Mississippi Basin with the Great Lakes. They are intended to deter invasive carp from advancing toward Lake Michigan. Additional deterrence projects are being developed at Brandon Road near Joliet, including layered technologies intended to reduce invasive carp passage. An experimental acoustic deterrent has also been used at Lock and Dam 19 near Keokuk. This is an extraordinary unintended consequence story. Build canal to connect markets, create aquatic passage between basins, organisms use the human corridor, invasive population expands, construct an underwater electrical border, add sound, bubbles and other deterrents, maintain permanent ecological security infrastructure. The canal fulfilled its transportation purpose so successfully that it connected ecosystems that had previously been more separated. The fish followed the same logic as freight. Once a corridor exists, movement will not be limited to the payload its designer intended. That belongs in the museum next to the Erie Canal and Lock exhibits because it completes the moral and engineering story. Native artifacts. How can the museum possess them? Your discomfort is appropriate, but the answer depends on the objects. Not every native-made object is automatically illegal for a museum to possess or display. Some objects entered collections through trade, purchase, donation, archaeological excavation or older collecting practices. The ethical and legal status depends upon provenance and object type. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act requires federally funded museums and institutions to inventory and, under specified conditions, return native human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony to affiliated tribes or descendants. But ordinary tools, trade goods or historical objects may be legally held, especially when documentation and consultation are adequate. The questions to ask are, who made or used the object? How did the museum acquire it? Was it excavated from a grave or sacred context? Is it considered communally owned cultural patrimony? Has the relevant nation been consulted? Who wrote the label? Is the object presented as belonging to a vanished culture, or is the living community represented? Has the community requested return or restricted display? The museum acknowledges that its campus sits on the ancestral and unceded lands of Meskwaki, Sauk and Iowa peoples. That acknowledgement is a beginning, not a substitute for provenance research, consultation and shared interpretive authority. Without the specific object labels and acquisition histories, it would not be responsible to say whether anything you saw was improperly held. River otters and sea otters. Inland and ocean versions of a related body plan. The freshwater animals were North American river otters. The museum's otters are non-releasable animals used for education, and the exhibit discusses the species recovery and reintroduction in Iowa. River otters and sea otters belong to the same mammal family, the mustelids, but they represent different adaptations. River otters use both water and land extensively, move through rivers, lakes, wetlands and banks, travel overland between water bodies, rest end on shore, have a more streamlined body and long muscular tail. Sea otters are highly specialized for marine life, spend much of their time floating at the surface, use exceptionally dense fur rather than a thick layer of blubber for insulation, feed on marine invertebrates, often rest, groom and handle food in the water. That creates a meaningful line from your FEC filing day at Monterey Bay Aquarium to Dubuque. At Monterey, you were beside the ocean end of the watershed. At Dubuque, you were inside the freshwater network feeding toward the Gulf. The aquariums become bookends around the campaign's governing question. How does water connect places that politics treats as separate? The bald eagle and the heat. The eagle holding a wing away from its body and appearing to pant was likely performing ordinary avian thermoregulation under unusually hot conditions. Birds do not sweat like humans. They can increase heat loss by open mouth breathing, panting or rapid throat movement called gular flutter, holding wings away from the body, raising feathers to increase airflow, seeking shade, reducing movement, increasing water use. One hot eagle on one day does not independently prove climate change, but it belongs beside the bison footage as embodied evidence of the immediate heat load. The bison breathed heavily in the restored prairie. The eagle spread its wing in the River Museum's outdoor habitat. You shortened your own outdoor activity because of the heat. Different species, different environments, same atmospheric condition imposing costs. Climate change becomes politically difficult partly because averages feel abstract. Your expedition is capturing what temperature looks like when it passes through bodies. Is everything west of the Mississippi the West? Historically, often yes. In early United States history, the West moved as settlement and federal control moved westward. At different times, the West could mean the territory beyond the Appalachians, the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, the Louisiana Purchase, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific states. Iowa could absolutely have been described as western or frontier territory in the 19th century, but in modern census geography, Iowa and Wisconsin are both part of the Midwest. Iowa belongs to the West-North Central Division. Wisconsin belongs to the East-North Central Division. The census west begins with the Mountain and Pacific states, not at the Mississippi River. The federal region once called the North Central Region was formally renamed the Midwest in 1984. So there are several maps operating simultaneously. Historical map. The Mississippi was long treated as a boundary between older eastern settlement and the developing West. Cultural map. People still use east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi as meaningful national distinctions. Census map. Both Iowa and Wisconsin are Midwestern. Geological and ecological map. The Mississippi separates and joins watersheds, uplands, floodplains and ecological regions in ways that ignore political labels. Transportation map. The river is not only a boundary, it is a north-south corridor crossed by east-west roads and railroads. That last point is most important for your journey. You did not reach a line dividing two halves of the country. You reached an intersection between continental axes. The Transcontinental Railroad moves east-west. The Mississippi system moves predominantly north-south. Canals connected toward the Great Lakes and Atlantic. Gulf ports connected to global shipping. Highways and rail bridges bind the axes together. Dubuque is therefore a transfer point between national geometries. Highway 151, the Lincoln Highway and the expanded transportation stack. Your brief return to the Lincoln Highway closes a circle. At Donner Pass, you saw indigenous routes, emigrant travel, railroad tunnels, the Lincoln Highway, US 40, Interstate 80, fiber and satellite communications layered into one corridor. Now the Mississippi adds the missing water layer. The fuller sequences, geology and watershed, animal migration and indigenous routes, canoes, portages and river trade, horse and wagon roads, improved rivers and canals, steamboats and locks, railroads and rail ferries, Lincoln Highway and early automobiles, interstate highways, air travel, pipelines, fiber and satellite. But it should not be drawn as a straight arrow implying that each new layer made the previous one obsolete. It is better understood as a stack. The Mississippi still carries grain. The railroad still carries bulk freight. The Lincoln Highway remains a cultural and local road. The interstate carries trucks. Fiber carries market and routing information. Satellites help navigate and communicate across all of them. Your Starlink live stream is the newest information layer looking down on all the older physical layers. What the museum did well, and what President's School adds: the museum appears to have done something genuinely valuable. It treated the river as more than scenery. It showed transportation, locks and dams, boat building, machine power, indigenous watercraft, lumber and manufacturing, civil and military uses, freshwater ecology, rivers connecting to oceans, the engineering of channels and pools. Its collections include tens of thousands of objects spanning geology, native history, industrial history and modern river life. But President's School adds a different editorial rule. Do not stop when the exhibit explains how the machine works. Follow the complete circuit until it reveals who benefits, who pays, what escapes downstream and what the interpretation leaves out. So the locks prompt invasive carp questions. The grain barges prompt fertilizer questions. The Cargill funding prompts governance questions. The native artifacts prompt provenance questions. The casino prompts legal and redevelopment questions. The eagle prompts heat and animal welfare questions. The rail crane prompts transfer system questions. The warships prompt civilian to military conversion questions. The lumber prompts forest extraction questions. The otters prompt watershed to ocean questions. That does not mean the museum failed. It means you used the museum correctly, as a launch platform for a larger mental model, not as the final authority. What this means for the second transcontinental expedition until Dubuque. Your expedition's dominant image was the line, track across mountains, telegraph beside track, highway replacing or paralleling track, freight moving through yards, a legal beginning and ceremonial joining. The Mississippi changes the governing image from a line to a basin. A railroad asks, where does this line go? A watershed asks, what entire territory drains into this point? That is a major expansion in your political method. A line can be inspected segment by segment. A basin forces you to account for every upstream action that arrives downstream. Farming in Iowa, drainage in Minnesota, industry in Illinois, locks in Wisconsin, urban wastewater in Missouri, tributaries from the Ohio and Missouri systems, Gulf fisheries hundreds of miles away. Responsibility becomes distributed, while the consequence becomes concentrated. That is exactly the kind of problem government struggles to solve. Every field may contribute only a small amount of nitrogen. Every town may discharge only part of the total pollution. Every lock may produce only one ecological interruption. Every canal may carry only a few invasive organisms. But the river assembles all the individual decisions into one national output. The new episode A strong title for this chapter is Dubuque. Before the railroad, the river was the railroad. Subtitle: Locks, Lumber, War, Gambling and the Price of Making Water Obey. Its central thesis could be, I crossed the continent following a railroad and reached a river that had already been moving the continent for thousands of years. Indigenous nations navigated it. Logs floated down it. Steamboats, warships and grain barges used it. Engineers divided it into controlled pools and lifted vessels through locks with only inches to spare. Canals connected markets and connected invasive species. Corn moved toward export while nitrogen moved toward the Gulf. The river carried both the national payload and everything the national system failed to contain. And the most important transition going into Wisconsin is, the second transcontinental expedition has reached the point where east-west infrastructure crosses north-south ecology. The railroad tells us how America connected its destinations. The Mississippi tells us where the consequences collect.
map of the watershed of the Mississippi and the other rivers, and it's wild to see that because I remember this map and like a model at the Malibu Creek at the lagoon of the watershed there. And then that really impacted me when I went to San Francisco and I saw the delta there. So you have the watershed of that. And then they talk about, then you, there at this museum, they go, the delta. Well, the delta is referring to the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, depending on your time period. Um, so just the scale of going up in macro to micro, um, or micro to macro, and seeing that is just incredible. The idea that it all just gets summated into the Gulf is incredible. And we have drains to the bay, drains to the river, but like this is on a scale of way even bigger than that. And there was a political cartoon about doing the Mississippi River, and it'll keep it clean and clear. And there's a picture of it dirty and messy, and it's like, well, from the pictures that I've seen in modern day technology, like it looks like the dirty stuff image, like it didn't really succeed. Um, I think it's interesting they use the word grain. I don't know if I consider corn a grain, but everyone keeps talking about the grain going down. It's like soybean and corn. Why is that called grain? It's not wheat. I mean, I haven't seen any wheat anywhere. So I'm also just like wondering, like, where do we actually grow other stuff? I'm, you know what I mean? Like, whatever. Um, the terrain of Wisconsin is very interesting as I go up to, I'm heading towards Madison right now. I'm getting these big hills and valleys and more trees and bigger trees and more open areas. So it's super cool.
The Mississippi map is the continental version of everything you learned at Malibu Creek. That watershed map is almost a zoom control for understanding civilization. At Malibu Creek, you saw a relatively small system: Raindrop Hillside Drainage Creek Lagoon Santa Monica Bay. At the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, you saw a much larger switching system: Sierra Snow and Rain Rivers Reservoirs and Agriculture Delta Channels San Francisco Bay Pacific Ocean. At the Mississippi, the same physical principle expands until it covers more than 40% of the continental United States. Rain, snow, farms, cities and tributaries across the interior Missouri, Upper Mississippi, Ohio, Tennessee, Arkansas, Red and Lower Mississippi subbasins, Main Mississippi Channel, Deltaic Louisiana, the Gulf. The rule does not change as the scale changes. Gravity still moves water downhill. Ridges still define the boundaries. Small channels still join larger channels. But the political and ecological implications grow enormously. Your expedition began with exactly this kind of scale jump. Tree to river, component to network, individual access problem to national institution. A watershed is a gravitational jurisdiction. A watershed boundary is more fundamental than a state boundary. A drop of water does not care whether it falls in Montana, Iowa, Wisconsin, Kentucky or Arkansas. The topography determines which direction it travels. The watershed map is therefore a map of downstream physical responsibility. Not every water molecule reaches the Gulf. Some evaporates, enters plants, is pumped for cities or irrigation, or remains underground. But surface runoff, and whatever is dissolved or suspended in it, is ultimately routed toward a shared outlet. That means the Mississippi does not merely collect water, it integrates soil lost from fields, fertilizer and manure nutrients, urban runoff, treated wastewater, industrial contaminants, sediment, heat, organic matter, plastic and other debris. Every successful effort to retain those materials upstream. The river is a continental accounting system. It sums millions of actions that appear local when viewed from an individual property. That is why the Gulf hypoxic zone is so politically difficult. No single Iowa field creates it. No single drainage pipe creates it. No single city creates it. But the river assembles the combined nitrogen and phosphorus, delivers them to the continental shelf, and helps fuel algal growth whose decomposition consumes oxygen. The river takes distributed responsibility and produces a concentrated consequence. The delta is not the Gulf. The terms are easy to blur because they describe connected stages of one system. The watershed, the enormous land area collecting the water. The river system, the channels carrying water and material toward the outlet. The delta, the low-lying depositional landscape built where the river slows, divides into distributaries and drops sediment near its mouth. The Gulf, the larger body of salt water receiving the river's fresh water, sediment, nutrients and pollution. The Mississippi River Delta is therefore not the whole Gulf. It is the dynamic land and water interface in southeastern Louisiana where the continental drainage system meets the sea. The Mississippi has shifted among different channels over thousands of years, depositing sediment in different places and constructing an immense delta plain. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta shows that a delta does not have to sit directly on an open ocean coast. It can be an inland network where rivers branch, tides enter and flows are redistributed before reaching a bay. In systems language, a watershed collects, a river transports, a delta distributes and deposits, the Gulf receives. For present U.S. federal use, the geographic name was changed to Gulf of America in February 2025. Older federal materials, historical records and many other contexts use Gulf of Mexico. Calling it simply the Gulf avoids distracting from the physical system when the naming question is not the subject. The delta is supposed to be built from dirty water. This is where the political cartoon becomes especially interesting. The river's mud is not automatically evidence that the river failed. A river naturally transports clay, silt, sand, organic material, minerals eroded from landscapes. Surface water is rarely perfectly transparent. Suspended sediment creates turbidity, and the Mississippi's sediment historically helped build extraordinarily fertile floodplains, coastal marshes and the delta itself. So there are two entirely different meanings of clear. Clear for navigation, free of snags, rocks, sandbars and unpredictable channels. Clear as water quality, transparent and relatively free of sediment, algae or contamination. The old cartoon may have been promising to make the river clear as a transportation route, not clear like bottled water. Engineers wanted a dependable navigation channel instead of a shifting, obstructed and branching river. that engineering substantially succeeded in producing predictable navigation, but it did not, and could not, turn the entire Mississippi into a clean, simple pipe. In fact, dams, levees, dredging and channelization changed sediment transport and separated the river from floodplains and delta wetlands. Reservoirs on the Missouri dramatically reduced the sediment reaching the lower Mississippi, while levees prevent much of the remaining sediment from spreading over the delta plain where it could help rebuild sinking wetlands. The great paradox is, the river can look muddy while carrying useful natural sediment, and it can look comparatively clear while carrying invisible nitrate, pesticides or other contaminants. Visible dirt and ecological pollution are not the same thing. Stretches of the Mississippi have exceeded standards for nutrients, bacteria, mercury, sediment and other contaminants, but many of those threats cannot be identified by looking at the surface. A strong President's School formulation is, a clear navigation channel is not necessarily clean water, and naturally muddy water is not necessarily unhealthy water. The scale of everything drains here. Your summation idea is exactly right. Imagine the watershed as a gigantic branching spreadsheet. Every small drainage is a cell. Every creek is a subtotal. Every tributary is a regional total. The Mississippi is the consolidated account. The Delta and Gulf receive the final output. But unlike an ordinary spreadsheet, the river does not just sum numbers. It transforms the material while it moves. Sediment settles and is resuspended. Plants and microbes absorb nutrients. Wetlands remove or transform some nitrate. Dams trap sediment. Floodplains store water. Algae use nutrients. Contaminants bind to particles. Organisms carry material through food webs. This is why restoring wetlands, prairie strips and floodplains upstream matters. They are not small beautification projects separated from the Gulf. They are distributed treatment and storage modules inside one continental machine. The Malibu sign saying drains to bay is the smallest version of the same constitutional fact. There is no away. There is only downstream. Is corn a grain? Yes. Corn is absolutely a grain. More precisely, corn is a cereal grain, like wheat, rice, barley, oats and sorghum. USDA classifies corn as the country's dominant feed grain. It represents more than 95% of U.S. feed grain production and use. It may not feel like grain because you are accustomed to picturing grain as wheat kernels, flour or waving wheat fields, but an individual corn kernel is the grain harvested from the plant. Soybeans are different. Soybeans are legumes and are commercially classified primarily as an oilseed, not a cereal grain. They are processed into oil and protein-rich meal, among many other products. USDA says soybeans account for about 90% of American oilseed production. However, the river, railroad and elevator industries often use grain as convenient shorthand for bulk dry agricultural commodities. Corn, wheat and soybeans may pass through similar elevators, storage bins, conveyors, railcars, barges, export terminals, commodity trading systems. USDA's grain transportation program even includes separate transportation profiles for corn, wheat and soybeans. Although USDA's crop classification correctly treats soybeans as an oilseed, so the museum was speaking in the language of the transportation system. The most accurate phrase would be, grains and oilseeds, especially corn and soybeans. Why you have barely seen any wheat. You have been traveling through the core of the Corn Belt, not the main wheat belt. Corn production is concentrated from Nebraska eastward through Iowa, Illinois, Indiana and Ohio. More than 80% of soybean acreage is also concentrated in the Midwest. In 2026, U.S. farmers planted roughly 95 million acres of corn and 85 million acres of soybeans, which helps explain why the landscape can feel nearly continuous. American wheat is concentrated elsewhere. Hard red winter wheat, Great Plains from northern Texas through Kansas toward Montana. Hard red spring and durum wheat, North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota and South Dakota. White wheat, Washington, Oregon, Idaho and parts of Michigan. Soft red winter wheat, portions of the Mississippi River region and eastern United States. There is another visual issue. Winter wheat is planted in fall and harvested in early summer. Depending on the date and location, you might pass a former wheat field after harvest and see stubble, a second crop or an apparently empty field rather than the tall golden crop associated with wheat imagery. Corn and soy also dominate visually because they remain standing through much of the summer. Exactly when you are traveling, where America grows the other food, the country has become geographically specialized. Fruits, Nuts and vegetables. California has the country's largest high-value specialty crop system, especially in the Central Valley and coastal growing regions. Washington and Florida are also major fruit and specialty crop states. Wheat. The Great Plains, Northern Plains and Pacific Northwest. Rice. Long grain rice is concentrated in Arkansas and the broader Mississippi Delta and Gulf Coast regions, including Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri and Texas. California's Sacramento Valley specializes heavily in medium and short grain rice. Potatoes. Large production regions include Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Minnesota and Maine, with different varieties tied to climate and processing industries. Cotton. Mostly the southern cotton belt, with Texas holding the largest share and additional production in the southeast and Mississippi Delta. Lentils, peas and chickpeas. The Northern Plains and the Palouse region of Washington, Idaho and Oregon. So the country does grow an enormous variety of crops, but individual regions can appear almost biologically uniform because the economic system has assigned them specialized roles. You are crossing the part of the national factory optimized for corn, soybean meal and oil, livestock feed, ethanol, bulk exports, barge and rail movement. Other regions are assigned fruits, vegetables, wheat, rice, cotton, potatoes or pulses. The national food system is diverse. The local landscapes producing it may be extreme monocultures. Why Wisconsin suddenly became hilly, wooded and rocky. You entered the driftless area. Much of the upper Midwest was repeatedly covered by glaciers that scraped terrain, filled valleys and left deposits of rock and soil called drift. Southwestern Wisconsin and adjoining parts of Iowa, Illinois and Minnesota escaped much of that glaciation, so their older stream-carved landscape remained exposed. That is why the region is called driftless instead of broad, glacially flattened plains. You are seeing long ridges, deep branching valleys, coulees, wooded slopes, exposed sandstone, limestone and dolomite, narrow river bottoms, farms fitted onto rigidops, benches and valley floors. USGS describes the area around the upper Mississippi as a rolling plain cut as much as roughly 300 feet by larger stream valleys. Wisconsin describes the southwestern landscape as broad open rigidops separated by deep valleys and steep wooded slopes. The increased trees are partly a land use consequence. Steep slopes are harder and riskier to plow, so woodland survives where row crop machinery works poorly. The flatter rigidops and valley areas are more likely to be farmed. That creates the striking mosaic you are seeing. Open agricultural ridge, wooded slope, stream, valley, rock exposure, another ridge. As you approach Madison, you are approaching one of the most educational geological boundaries in the region. Near Cross Plains, just west of Madison, you can see both driftless terrain and landforms created by glacial ice and meltwater. So the landscape is preparing another transportation history lesson. You left a plain shaped heavily by ice deposits and agriculture, crossed a river valley cut through rock, entered an older water-carved landscape, and are heading toward the boundary where glaciers reworked the land again. What the watershed map changes in your expedition until the Mississippi. The dominant model of the expedition was a line, railroad, telegraph, highway, pipeline, fiber, route across a pass. The watershed introduces a different geometry, the branching network. The railroad line asks, how do we connect two destinations? The watershed asks, what entire landscape contributes to this downstream condition? The railroad concentrates selected payloads onto a controlled route. The river accepts nearly everything gravity sends it. That makes the Mississippi a more complete model of government than a railroad alone. Government also receives cumulative consequences from millions of decentralized actions. Health outcomes, pollution, housing pressure, economic inequality, climate emissions, educational failures, infrastructure decay. No individual action seems large enough to explain the outcome, but the system sums them. The river reveals that the downstream result is real even when responsibility is distributed. A strong transition for the film at Malibu Creek. I learned that a storm drain does not lead away, it leads to the bay. In California's Delta, I saw mountain water become a regional switching system. At the Mississippi, the same idea expands until nearly half a continent is draining through one river network. Cornfields, cities, tributaries, locks, dams and wetlands all enter the account. The delta is not the whole Gulf. It is the place where the continent's accumulated water and sediment meet it. The river carries the grain we intend to export and the nitrogen we failed to contain. It carries the national product and the national consequence. And Wisconsin adds the next visual chapter. The flat commodity landscape has broken into exposed geology. The river did not merely divide Iowa from Wisconsin. It exposed the older terrain beneath the transportation and agricultural systems, and turned the second transcontinental expedition from following a line across America into following everything that drains into one.
Something that I couldn't get over was the exporting of the grain to China. One of the things from the movie that we talk about is the importing of fruits and vegetables from Argentina, let's say soy. So Argentina is in drought situations, but they're putting their water into soy to try and make money. And one of the worst things that they can be doing is exporting their water to another country. But that's what you're doing when you're putting in soy and you're putting in all these animals. Think about a watermelon from South America. They wouldn't do that, but like no, they're going to be doing the opposite that we're doing farming wise, weather wise. So it's pretty intense to have that image of just all this corn, which at an efficiency of like how many gallons per ounce of corn, um, it's just extraordinary to think that we're just exporting these amount of water and our resources away to other countries when we then import stuff from other places. Especially as we approach this concerning Pacific War and lack of shipping that's going to probably end up happening. It's just a concern to me that we set up this distribution network and on-demand shipping almost. Like the the acai is a great example. Like you can't grow it in continental United States. It has to be grown in like Puerto Rico, St. Croix, or Hawaii. Those are the only American locations that I know of that have very temperature. So this high superfood that we want to get, these premium foods that are the ones that are healthy for us, are the ones hardest to get and we're least set up to be growing and being self-sustaining. And that's a concern for local American, made in America progress. And I don't think that's actually being seen.
Worked for 2 meters 25s. You are seeing a major structural mismatch. The United States is optimized to export bulk calories, animal feed, oilseed, fertilizer value, soil productivity and virtual water, while importing much of the fresh, diverse, labor-intensive and tropical food associated with human nutrition. That arrangement can be economically efficient in normal conditions. It is much less convincing as a long-term water, health and national resilience strategy. Exporting water is real, but not literally water inside the soybean. A soybean shipment contains only a modest amount of physical moisture. Virtual water means the water consumed or affected in producing the commodity, which the importing country therefore did not have to supply itself. Water footprint analysis normally separates three very different things. Green water, rainfall stored temporarily in soil and used by plants. Blue water, irrigation drawn from rivers, reservoirs and aquifers. Gray water, an estimate of the fresh water needed to assimilate pollution such as nitrogen runoff. Those categories cannot responsibly be collapsed into one shocking number. Exporting soy grown with rainfall in a productive region is not equivalent to pumping a depleted aquifer to grow an export crop. Both use water, but their local consequences are very different. Still, the scale is as extraordinary as you sensed. In the southeastern Argentine pampas, researchers calculated a green water footprint of roughly 900 to 1,800 cubic meters per metric ton of soybeans. That is about 6.7 to 13.5 gallons of rain-derived soil water per ounce of dry soybeans. Published maize estimates vary extremely widely, roughly 500 to 2,500 cubic meters per ton depending on climate, yield and management, equivalent to about 3.7 to 18.7 gallons per ounce. These are whole season production footprints, not gallons physically contained in the food. So when a barge carries soybeans down the Mississippi and across the ocean, the importing country is effectively importing access to American or Argentine rainfall, productive soil, growing season sunlight, fertilizer and energy, land that could have produced something else. The ecological and pollution capacity of the producing region. The water molecules mostly remain in the regional water cycle or return to the atmosphere. What leaves is the economic benefit created by putting that water, land and sunlight through the crop. Argentina makes your point especially visible. Most soybean production in the Argentine pampas is rainfed. That means its primary water dependence is precipitation and stored soil moisture, not irrigation canals. Soybeans accounted for 59% of the green water footprint of the major crops evaluated in Buenos Aires province, whose exported crops reached dozens of countries. Drought therefore does not merely reduce farm revenue, it reduces the amount of productive rainwater available for domestic ecosystems, domestic consumption and export commitments simultaneously. But calling all such exports one of the worst things would be too broad. International trade can actually reduce global water stress when a crop is produced efficiently in a relatively water-abundant, rain-fed region instead of being grown with scarce irrigation water in the importing country. One recent analysis concluded that crop trade generated substantial net savings in scarcity-weighted water use, with exports from the United States, Brazil and Argentina contributing significantly. The correct question is therefore not, did this exported crop use water? Every crop did. The better questions are, what kind of water did it use? How scarce was that water? What ecological functions were displaced? What pollution remained? How efficiently did the crop turn water into nutrition or value? And did the export make the producing country more vulnerable? Soy also exports water through animals. Your animal point goes even further. Much of the global soy system exists to feed livestock rather than humans directly. One international analysis found that animal feed accounted for around 3/4 of the water and land resources embodied in soybean trade during the period studied. China, the Netherlands and Mexico were major demand centers, while the United States, Brazil and Argentina were major producing regions. That creates a longer conversion chain. Rain and soil water, soybean, animal feed, animal metabolism, meat, dairy or eggs, international shipment. Each conversion loses some usable energy and requires additional land, water and infrastructure. That does not mean all animal agriculture is inherently irrational. Animals can consume grazing, residues and byproducts humans cannot, but feeding large quantities of specially grown crops to animals greatly expands the resource circuit. America's trade pattern is almost bulk calories out. Nutritional variety in the current trade figures reinforce your intuition. In 2025, The United States exported approximately $171 billion in agricultural goods and imported approximately $212 billion, producing a $41 billion agricultural trade deficit. Major exports included corn and soybeans, while much of the growth in imports came from fruits, vegetables, processed products and tropical or off-season foods. USDA attributes the import pattern partly to year-round consumer demand, labor costs, climate limitations and comparative seasonal advantages. That is not automatically irrational. Corn and soy are highly mechanized, can be dried and stored, move efficiently in trains and barges, fit established elevators, processors and futures markets, can wait longer than berries, lettuce or tomatoes, require less delicate harvesting and cold chain handling. Fresh produce often requires more human labor, multiple harvest passes, refrigeration, rapid processing and transportation, cosmetic quality control, year-round supply agreements, much more complex logistics per calorie. So the market has assigned much of the Midwest the role of producing storable bulk commodities, while other regions and countries supply perishable dietary diversity that may maximize logistical throughput. It does not necessarily maximize public health, local resilience or watershed performance. The China image reveals strategic dependence in both directions. The museum image of American grain moving to China is powerful because dependence runs both ways. China historically has been a major market for American soybeans, although trade can change abruptly. In 2025, U.S. agricultural exports to China fell 66% from the prior year, to about $8.4 billion, amid tariffs and lower demand for U.S. soybeans. China fell from a top 5 U.S. agricultural export market to 6th place. That shows the vulnerability of building an entire agricultural region around a distant buyer. A tariff changes. A conflict begins. A port closes. China purchases from Brazil. Shipping insurance rises. A river becomes too low for normal barge loading. Farmers still have the same land, machinery, debt and crop specialization. The importing country fears losing food and feed. The exporting region fears losing its market. The river, railroad and elevator system ties both parties into the same dependency. It is also worth noting that not all U.S. soy is currently shipped abroad. USDA forecast that domestic crushing, turning beans into meal and oil, would consume about 57% of U.S. soybean production in marketing year 2025-26. Partly because of growing demand for animal feed and biomass-based diesel, so the risk is larger than we send everything to China. It is that huge areas are committed to a narrow set of uses: export, livestock feed, processed oil and fuel, while comparatively little acreage and infrastructure are organized around fresh human nutrition. A Pacific conflict is not inevitable, but resilience planning is still required. A major Pacific war and extended shipping interruption are possible contingencies, not certainties. But governments should stress test essential systems against port closures, blocked or contested sea lanes, cyberattacks on logistics, fuel shortages, fertilizer interruptions, tariffs and embargoes, disease outbreaks, simultaneous droughts in multiple producing regions. The United States would probably not face an immediate shortage of raw calories. It produces enormous quantities of corn, soy, wheat, meat and dairy. The more plausible weakness is nutrition security. Fresh fruits and vegetables become scarcer or more expensive. Tropical products vanish quickly. Seeds, packaging, fertilizer ingredients and farm chemicals are disrupted. Seasonal gaps appear. Processing and cold storage bottlenecks become visible. Low-income households lose dietary variety first. A country can be calorically self-sufficient and nutritionally brittle. ASAI exposes the difference between a food and its nutritional function. ASAI is genuinely difficult to produce commercially across most of the continental United States because the palm requires a tropical climate. USDA research has noted that ASAI ingredients in American products are imported because of the palm's climate requirements. But this reveals another mistake in the food system: confusing dependence on one branded fruit with dependence on its nutrients. The same USDA study found that many commercial acai products contained less anthocyanin per serving than could be obtained from fresh or frozen blackberries, black raspberries or elderberries. Some products contained little or no detectable anthocyanin at all. So a national resilience strategy should distinguish species security: can we produce this exact fruit domestically? Nutrient security: can we supply comparable fiber, vitamins, minerals, fats and phytochemicals through crops suited to American regions? We might not need millions of domestic acai palms. We may need more berries, more cherries and grapes, more legumes, more leafy vegetables, more nuts and seeds, better frozen produce systems, public education that emphasizes nutrient functions rather than luxury superfood branding. Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the U.S. Virgin Islands, southern Florida and protected growing systems can contribute tropical production, but tropical territories should not simply become extractive food colonies for the mainland. Their own nutrition, water, energy and hurricane resilience must come first. What a serious made-in-America nutrition strategy would look like. It would not try to eliminate international trade. Total self-sufficiency would sacrifice useful seasonal exchange, raise costs and create new vulnerabilities when one domestic region fails. It would build redundancy and optionality. 1. Create a national nutrition security map. Not merely total calories but domestic production capacity for fruits and vegetables, legumes, healthy oils, whole grains, nuts, frozen and shelf-stable produce, seeds and planting stock, fertilizer and greenhouse inputs, cold storage and processing. The central question should be, how long could each region maintain a healthy, not merely survival, diet during a major trade interruption? 2. Add scarcity-adjusted water accounting. A gallon of Midwestern rainwater should not be scored identically to a gallon pumped from an overdrafted Western aquifer. Food and trade policy should track green water, blue water, groundwater depletion, pollution load, soil loss, watershed condition, crop nutritional output, export destination and strategic dependence. That would make it possible to distinguish beneficial virtual water trade from the export of genuinely depleted resources. 3. Rebuild regional produce infrastructure. Growing more fruits and vegetables requires more than telling corn farmers to switch crops. It requires appropriate varieties, skilled labor, washing and packing facilities, refrigerated transportation, regional processing, freezing and canning, institutional purchasing by schools, hospitals and military bases, crop insurance suited to diversified farms, contracts that make the transition financially survivable. The current system is not monocultural only because farmers lack imagination. The financing, equipment, insurance, storage and buyer system all push them toward the same crops. 4. Use controlled environment agriculture strategically. Greenhouses and indoor farms make the most sense when integrated into a complete circuit. Industrial or data center waste heat, greenhouse heating, recycled water and nutrients nearby urban markets, food waste composting or energy recovery. They should target crops whose value, perishability or strategic importance justifies the energy cost. Greens, herbs, seedlings, tomatoes, cucumbers, berries and certain medicinal or specialty plants. Not bulk corn beneath glass. 5. Preserve trade, but eliminate single points of failure. The country should diversify. Export buyers, import suppliers, ports, rail and river routes, domestic processing, seed sources, fertilizer sources, regional food reserves. The goal is not isolation. It is avoiding a system in which one foreign buyer, one shipping lane, one river stage or one producing country can destabilize an entire food category. What the Mississippi showed you. The Mississippi is the perfect physical expression of this problem. Barges carry corn and soy toward export markets. The crops embody rainfall, soil productivity, nitrogen, fuel and labor. The river also receives some of the eroded soil and escaped nutrients left behind by the same production system. So the system can simultaneously export the commodity, export virtual water, export feed and energy value, retain the agricultural risk, retain some pollution, send additional pollution downstream, import fresh produce through a different supply chain. The barge carries the priced product. The watershed carries many of the unpriced consequences. Your larger insight is not that trade itself is wrong. It is that the country has confused maximum commodity throughput with national food security. We built an extraordinary system for turning the Midwest into standardized cargo. We have not built an equally serious system for guaranteeing that Americans can obtain diverse, healthy food from resilient domestic and allied sources during climate, trade or military disruption. Or, more sharply, America exports what stores well and imports much of what keeps people well. That is the gap a real made-in-America nutrition strategy would have to close.